you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Luke. Today I'm coming at you with my way too early wide receiver ranking for 2023. Now I just uploaded my way too early running back ranking video, so if you haven't seen that yet, make sure to go check that out. Basically the same concept here, just gonna be going through the top 24. Basically the same concept here, just gonna be going through my top 24 wide receiver rankings so far for 2023. Obviously it is way too early for any of this to be relatively definitive at all. Just kind of a fun exercise to just kind of see where everything stands in my mind right now. A couple things I want to know: I don't have any of the incoming rookies in these rankings, so if you expect them to be here, they're not going to be. That'll happen after they actually get drafted and everything, and we get all their numbers and whatnot. Also, all of the stats that I'll be talking about, they're all in half PPR format. And also, these are really hard at this point right now. Like pretty much the wide receiver 15 through about 30 can be almost interchanged, so a lot of it is going to differ from what you guys think and what it's going to look like a lot later on. So don't get too mad at me if you think I have someone ranked way too high or way too low. Just put them down in the comments below. Let me know what you think and why, and I would love to hear it because there's still so much to be figured out as offseason goes on. But this is where I'm going to stand right now with all of my guys. One last thing, make sure to drop on the like in the video. It helps out so much. I can't even tell you guys. Like I said, comment and make sure to subscribe. I'm going to be having content coming out the entire offseason, getting ready for this next fantasy football season so we can all dominate. So let's get into it. All right, I think pretty clearly wide receiver 1 is going to be Justin Jefferson. He was the wide receiver 1 this past year, and he had some pretty bad games and doesn't have one of the most elite quarterbacks. So if he can still do that and just dominate, I mean, he's pretty much dominated since he stepped foot on an NFL field. Not a really ton to be discussed here. I mean, he's an absolute stud, and I assume he'll probably be a top 5 pick off the board this upcoming year. I think the wide receiver 2 could have a conversation of be going over him depending on what happens. Who I have Jamar Chase, my wide receiver 2. He was hurt a lot of this year, but he was unbelievable when he actually did play. He had actually no bad games when he was healthy. I think the thing that could push him over Justin Jefferson this offseason would be if T. Higgins did leave. There is a lot of kind of conversation going on about that right now. I have no idea what's actually going to happen there, but if for some reason T. Higgins does get traded, then I do think I might put Jamar Chase over Justin Jefferson, but regardless, Chase is going to be an absolute stud for years to come. So I got him here, my wide receiver 2. If you want to take him at 1, go for it. Then my wide receiver 3, another guy who honestly could be at 1 as well, is going to be Cooper Kupp. Before he got hurt, he was a wide receiver 1, and I don't really foresee any changes going on this offseason. Looks like he'll be a lot of the same thing. He's going to be 30 years old, so I guess that's the one worry, but I'm not really too worried about that at this point. So we just got to make sure that everyone is coming back how it was, and I think at worst, he's a top 3 wide receiver this next year. Then my wide receiver 4, I'm going to have Tyreek Hill there. His quarterback Tua missed a lot of time this past year, and he was still a top 5 wide receiver at the end of the year. So nothing really seemed like he was slowing down, just utilized very efficiently in this new offense. I guess there is a small concern with like Waddle taking over more work, but I don't know. They're very similar play styles, and Waddle was fantastic this past year, so I don't know how much more he could take over. So I'm not really too worried about that, but I guess I just wanted to mention it here. So I got him here, my wide receiver 4. And on my wide receiver 5, I have Devontae Adams. Probably has the most question marks in this top 5, really just coming down to the quarterback situation now that Derek Carr is going to be gone. We don't know exactly what's going to happen there, but I think we've seen him dominate with basically everyone he's played with, and he was a wide receiver 3 this past year, so he could get an upgrade at quarterback. I don't know how much of a downgrade he could get. Regardless, though, I think he's still going to be elite this next year. Then on my wide receiver 6, we were going to have Stephon Diggs there, who was one of the best wide receivers this whole year up until like kind of the very end, and then started to struggle a bit. But this is one of the best offenses in the NFL. He's one of the best wide receivers. No real reason for him to slow down. There's just a little bit of a capped up side just given the way that Josh Allen runs the ball and everything, similar to the next person we have, but I still think he's one of the best options. Just the other guys above him I think are just slightly better, but I mean, we're splitting hairs still at this point. Then my wide receiver 7, I'm going to have AJ Brown, who was wide receiver 5 this past year, just absolutely dominating. A lot of people definitely did not expect him to finish that high. I know I didn't, just based off of Jalen Hurts not being an elite quarterback, him running the ball a lot, having Devonta Smith as a second option. But all of that aside, he still finished as a top 5 wide receiver, and we found out that Jalen Hurts is actually very good at throwing the ball. I think Devonta Smith being there and being as good as he showed to be this past year is the only thing that's really holding him back from being like a top 5 option, but Top 7, I mean, could go down to 8, but I don't really see him going any lower than that. He could go a little bit higher. Regardless, one of the best wide receiver options in the NFL. Absolute stud. And I think the last guy I have in like the really elite tier at my wide receiver 8 is going to be CeeDee Lamb, who definitely kind of struggled at the beginning of the year, but absolutely broke out at the end of the year. I do think that they're going to bring in a new wide receiver this offseason, just because I think they really need it. So it could take away from a little bit of his upside, but I think that he showed that he's that alpha we all thought he could be. And I think it's just going to continue this next year. Moving on to the wide receiver 9, I have Amon-Ra St. Brown there. This is a little bit difficult to really know where to rank him. I think Jared Goff will be back this next year. He was really good, and Amon-Ra finishes the wide receiver 9 with him being there and while missing some time. I think he's honestly going to be a really like PPR guy, going to get a ton of volume. I don't know how many touchdowns he'll really get, so I have him a little bit lower. There's also the whole Jameson Williams things coming on here, who I think is probably a better talent, but we haven't really seen it at the NFL level consistently at all. But that does limit a little bit of the ceiling. I still think he's going to be a low-end wide receiver 1 this year, so I think he's going to be pretty solid. Could go a little bit lower just depending on what happens with these guys behind him, but right now I got him here at wide receiver 9. My wide receiver 10, I'm going to have Jalen Waddle, the counterpart to Tyreek Hill. Not really too worried about having 2 wide receivers in the top 10. We have a next guy is also another teammate who is really good. I think we've seen over the past years that if they're elite, I mean, they're just going to dominate. And Jalen Waddle finished as a wide receiver 7 this past year and was a lot better while Tua was playing. Doesn't really seem like there's going to be too much change. I would say the only real concern is Tua staying healthy throughout the year, because I think that if Tua is healthy, Jalen Waddle will easily finish as the top 10 wide receiver. So that's the only thing we got to worry about. But regardless, I think he's going to be great just because of how talented he is. Then in my wide receiver 11, I'm going to have T. Higgins there. He was also kind of hurt this past year, so didn't finish that great, but when he's on the field, he was unbelievable. I talked about him a bit with Jamar Chase, where there's a possibility of him leaving, so that's obviously a massive question mark with him and his ranking and where he'll go. I think we need to keep in mind what I talked about in my lessons learned video, where these wide receivers switching teams, if they're elite, they're just going to be elite. I do think T. Higgins falls into that category, so I think if he goes somewhere else, it's just going to help out T. Higgins a bunch, assuming the quarterback is going to be someone good. But it'll help out T. Higgins a bunch, it'll help out that quarterback a bunch, it'll help out everyone else on the team. We need to keep that in mind, but I still have no idea if he's actually going to get moved. I think this is right around where he'll be ranked if he's on the Bengals, and he could go higher or lower depending where he goes if he gets moved. Then the last guy in the wide receiver 1 category, at my wide receiver 12, I have Garrett Wilson. I mean, he's just an absolute stud. The quarterback position is obviously the massive question mark here. He was never very good with Zach Wilson, but when Mike White was starting, he was unbelievable. I mean, there was only 3 weeks where he started in a row, but over that 3-week span, Garrett Wilson was the wide receiver 3. And I mean, I think at worst, Mike White would be the starter. I do imagine they'll get someone else who's probably better. And so obviously I don't think he's going to be the wide receiver 3, but any slight quarterback upgrade, Garrett Wilson is just so good that I think he'll be fantastic for fantasy. And on to my wide receiver 13, I think the last guy in this second tier, we're going to have Devonta Smith, who finished as a wide receiver 10 this past year. He did actually goose his very first game. So from week 3 on, he was wide receiver 7. And from week 13 on, he was a wide receiver 2, only behind A.J. Brown, funny enough. So I think Devonta showed that he is more than capable of producing for fantasy. Obviously, having A.J. Brown and the running quarterback takes away from his upside, but I think regardless, Devonta is just going to be too good to go any lower than this. This honestly even feels low for me, but I think he'll be right around this low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2 territory. Then after him, I'm going to have DK Metcalf, who this feels a little bit high for. He did finish at the wide receiver 18 this past year, so I guess it's not too much of a difference, but he was honestly very surprising. Same thing with Tyler Lockett, who we'll talk about later, but he was very surprising, just the entire Seahawks offense was, and it seems like everyone will be back, so there's not too much to really worry about. But I do think that Geno just limits that like elite upside that DK could have, so I'm gonna have him here at my wide receiver 14. I think he could move down a little bit. I don't think he'll move any higher, but I think this is a pretty fair spot for him. Wide receiver 15, a really tough season for Deebo Samuel, but I think there were just so many question marks in SF, and I mean, he still showed his flashes, of course. Hopefully they get some more stability this offseason and he can be more utilized in the way he was the previous year. This also feels a little bit high for him, but like I said, once we hit DK Metcalf, basically from here on out, almost anyone could be switched out. Like the guys I'm going to talk about, like in the 20s, they could honestly be up here. There's just such a small difference between all of them, and really just kind of see how it all plays out. So moving on though to my wide receiver 16, I'm going to have Chris Olave here. This is another question mark with the quarterback situation. Right now, it sounds like Derek Carr is going there, but that has not been confirmed yet. And that would definitely be an upgrade from everything he had this past year, although not like a massive upgrade like I talked about with the mediocre quarterbacks. But Chris Olave, the difference with those mediocre quarterbacks I talked about is that Chris Olave showed that he's really good. Like the first 11 weeks of the season, he was a wide receiver 11. So I think that this ranking is more than justified, especially if he gets a quarterback upgrade like Derek Carr. I think this wide receiver 16 tag is probably right around where he should be. Moving on to number 17, I have Amari Cooper here. He finished actually as high as a wide receiver 9 this year, which is pretty crazy. But when Deshaun Watson was a quarterback, he was actually the wide receiver 23 from that point on. Now, like I talked about with Nick Chubb in the last video, I think that this offense will definitely be better than what they showed when Deshaun Watson was there. Not that they have a full off season and he can really get back into playing, but definitely worried a little bit. I think he could definitely finish higher. We saw with Jacoby Brissett, and I think most of us can agree that Deshaun Watson is a better quarterback than Jacoby Brissett. So there's a good chance that he can move up, but it definitely was worrisome what we saw at the end of the year. On to my wide receiver 18, I'm going to have Keenan Allen here. There's some small rumors that he could be gone from the Chargers this season, so we'll have to wait and see it. That would surprise me a bit. And he was pretty hurt this past year, so he didn't really finish high. Once he finally was healthy from week 12 on, he was actually the wide receiver 4, which I thought was crazy looking back on that, because I know I had him and it sure did not feel like that. Probably because I was out of the playoffs by the time he was healthy, so it didn't really matter, but it's good to see that he's still got it. So we're just going to have to see if he's still on the team or not. If he is, I'm sure he'll move up higher than this. Moving on to the wide receiver 19, I'm going to have DeAndre Hopkins here. Now, the main worry really is that Kyler Murray is not going to be healthy probably to start the year. But when DeAndre Hopkins was back and Kyler Murray was healthy, which was from week 7 to week 13, DeAndre Hopkins was the wide receiver 4 over that entire time. So not having Kyler is definitely going to be worrisome. Going to have a new head coach, but I mean, DeAndre Hopkins is DeAndre Hopkins. He will be 31 next year, so he's starting to kind of approach that older range. But I think he's just going to be so good that those contested catches and those short routes that he'll be a PPR monster for still a couple more years if he wants to. Moving on to wide receiver 20, I'm going to have Mike Williams. I think one of the big issues with him is that he just is always hurt. But when he's healthy, I mean, he's great. Over the first 7 weeks of the season, he was the wide receiver 9, but then he couldn't really stay healthy. Like I talked about with Keenan, where he could be gone. If he's gone, then Mike Williams will go way up because he's just going to get so much more opportunity. But if that does happen, I would imagine that they would probably draft a wide receiver. So a lot to really be sorted out here. We'll just have to wait and see. Similar to my wide receiver 21, Christian Watson. The question mark really here is if he's going to have Aaron Rodgers or not. Because if he has Aaron Rodgers, he's going to be an absolute stud. He really struggled at the beginning of the year, but once he finally had that great game where he broke out, he was unbelievable from then on. So that was from week 10 on. He was the wide receiver 7, which is, I mean, pretty good. I don't obviously think he'll be up there, but he could move up to that, wide receiver 14, 15 range if Aaron Rodgers is back. So really just got to wait and see what comes out of this darkness retreat, and then we might have a better idea where we can actually rank him. Moving on to my wide receiver 22, I have Terry McLaurin here, who did finish actually wide receiver 14, which is really good, honestly. Didn't really feel like that until like back end of the year. As of right now, the Commanders are saying that Sam Howell is their starting quarterback. So if that's the case, I think this is probably right around where he'll be ranked. I think that wide receiver 14, honestly, with all the quarterback play we've seen from Terry McLaurin in his career, I just don't think that he'll really finish any higher unless he gets an elite quarterback. And Sam Howell, I just don't think is really that guy. I don't think that's really breaking news to anybody. But I think he's going to be someone who will be, pretty safe floor, but I just don't see much of an upside with Terry McLaurin. Okay, on to my wide receiver 23. I have Chris Godwin here. The issue here is that we just have no idea what the quarterback situation is going to be. Since Brady retired, right now I guess Kyle Trask is their starting quarterback, which I would be surprised if they actually started the season with him, but it's just something we're going to have to wait and see, and I just can't put him any higher until we know what's going to be actually going on there. And then the last guy that I want to mention is going to be Tyler Lockett, who actually finished as the wide receiver 13 this past year, which is just unbelievable. I mean, I feel like he goes under the radar every single year with how good he is. He's been doing this for like over half a decade now, just finishing as a top 15 wide receiver. Every single year we say, I don't think he's going to do it again this year, and he does it. I'm not going to draft him as a top 15 wide receiver, but I think being at worst a wide receiver 2 is where he should be. So that's where I got him right now, my wide receiver 24. Like I said in the beginning, there are some honorable mentions that I want to go through. And honestly, any of these guys could move their way up into the 20s, into the teens. It's just really hard at this point, and we're just going to need to get like a lot more information on all these situations until we can really determine where all these guys go. So those honorable mentions will be Mike Evans, DJ Moore, Drake London, Christian Kirk, Jerry Jeudy, Calvin Ridley, and George Pickens. Definitely feels weird not having Christian Kirk or like Mike Evans in here. I feel like Christian Kirk definitely should be, just with how good he was. But the whole Calvin Ridley thing definitely is scaring me away. But, you know, like I said, these guys could really kind of fit in anywhere. But yeah, these are my way too early top 24 wide receiver rankings for 2023. Let me know what you guys think about them. Like I said, a ton still to figure out, so a lot of this is subject to change and will change, but this is just how I'm feeling right now, getting a glance at the landscape for this upcoming year. I will have my quarterback and tight end video coming out next. I'm not sure yet if it'll be 12 or 15, but it's going to be one of those two, so stay tuned for that. Make sure to subscribe to the channel to see that. Drop a like on this video. I'll see you on the next one.